Hello and welcome back to another episode of Reducing Your Compliance Costs. My name is Jim and I'll be your host for the next few minutes. Today we're going to look at the 7 mistakes. We're going to start with the first one that executives make inside of financial institutions in dealing with regulatory costs that causes the regulatory cost to go up each and every year. So first one is not identifying that true cost of compliance. That's the only way we can deal with it is to really understand what that is. So we'll start there. So let's get your gears in your mind working here by asking some questions. Do you know what you spend today on compliance? And do you have a budget for compliance? Well, most of the executives we polled didn't know how much they were spending on compliance. In fact, 86% didn't have a number. They didn't know what they were spending. That same 86% didn't have a budget for compliance because without knowing the number, it's hard to budget. Now, my inspiration here in understanding your numbers, the ING commercial. We see the two executives here that are waiting on the elevator to get to their offices here, and they're embracing their number. That's their retirement number because this is the way that we can manage that number. And I hope that you embrace your number by the end of this meeting because I think it's really important for you to understand. Our value pivot is our changes. The change that I'm asking you to make here is to understand the value of compliance. And you understand the intrinsic value, but I want to understand the dollars and cents value by what you're spending. So that's our pivot. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to learn the cost drivers at the base of our pyramid. The middle part here is the cost composition. That's what makes up the cost inside of the walls of your institution. Then we're actually going to pinpoint that actual cost. That's the point of our pyramid. So let's dive right in. Well, the true cost drivers behind the compliance costs are a little bit more indirect and probably maybe not so obvious to most people, but the cost drivers are ambiguity, indecision, and logistics. Let's look at ambiguity for a moment. Take policies today. Typical policy uses words like periodic and best judgment and best practices. Those words mean different things to different people. And when it comes to interpretation, if you don't understand the meaning, say the word periodic, is that every 6 months that I need to do this task or chore and that's written in the policy, or is it every year, or is it just right before the examiners come in? Well, that leads to indecision because if it's not direct, people don't know how to act on it. They'll ask questions. They'll need some additional guidance, and they'll often put off what needs to be done today, costing you more money and more time. Finally, logistics. There hasn't been lots of meaningful upgrades in logistical technologies and innovations within our operations for compliance in quite some time. So let's use our policy example, to go find the policy that you need to read when you need to read it can often be a challenge. Somewhere between a challenge, I guess, and what some folks say a nightmare to get the right version of the document so you can find the words that you need to read inside that document to get some clear understanding. Without those clear logistics, that leads to time and expense as well. So the costs are a little bigger than most people think. Not a gazillion like we see here in that same ING ad. Let me shed some light on this. So the traditional view of the time it's spent is we think we've got a couple of personnel in our or a couple percent, maybe 5% of our personnel that spends their day in compliance. But all the evidence, and I'm about to show you, is that number you're spending in compliance is much bigger. It is 5 times bigger, so nearly 20% of time is spent doing regulatory compliance across your personnel. Let me show you what I mean. So in this chart here, you can see here, I've broken out the major departments within a $200 million bank. And on this column, I'm showing how many people are in that department or full-time equivalents. Then I'm looking at what the percentage of their time is spent doing compliance work. And then I'm calculating, which is a new term for a lot of folks, and that is a compliance full-time equivalency, or CFTE. The way this breaks down, we'll look at the first line here, and in our executive in operations, this basically is the front of our business and the back office of our business, the executives and the operations folks. There's $800 million $200 million bank between those two sides of the house. In those areas, they spend 40% of their time in compliance. They're like, wow, that seems like a lot of time. And in fact, that's gone up and doubled in the last 10 years alone. So the evidence comes from about 300 business cases that I've done in working in the seat that I sit in at Continuity Control as its co-founder and chief strategy officer, and then work that I've done with Graduate School of Banking programs and profitability programs. So we calculate a lot of the time. And executives and operations folks spend an increasing amount of time working with examiners, working with auditors in compliance areas, and working on implementations and strategies related to keeping up with regulatory compliance costs and arising issues such as vendor due diligence, vendor management, third parties, and enterprise risk management. So lots of time. So if we take our 8 folks that are in those, we multiply 40% of their time, we get 3.2 of full-time compliance, full-time equivalency, or 3.2 FTEs loss in productivity to compliance. Now, when we tally these things up, what we're going to see is there's going to be, department by department, sometimes there's a modest amount of time that you're spending in compliance, such as our deposit operations, but it's multiplied by 17 people, 18 people, maybe even 20 people, and that adds up. So as we add these numbers up, we come up with 10.35 CFTEs in our $200 million bank on 48 full-time equivalencies. So that's over 20% of the time that's spent in doing compliance across the entire organization. The bottom line effect is the cost is $30 an hour. That's $621,000 on $30 an hour, rather. So big numbers. Well, if that wasn't enough, our guy here looks very surprised. There's direct costs as well that add up for each and every organization. So both indirect and direct, as you can see, while this number, $210,000 across all of these different expenses, this is broken down by department by department, what you're spending here. Highlights here are audit and exams, where there's lots of direct expenses spent in those areas. It tallies up to $210,500, but it's still much smaller than that personnel expense across the entire institution. So what are our other CEOs saying? Larry Ziegler, the president of First National Bank Stoughton, he said he's spending $750,000 a year, and he's only about $487 million. In the same article, Steve Baden said he spent 600 or surpassed 600,000. He's $419 million. So really big numbers. That's what other CEOs are saying. Well, here's how to calculate your number. Remember, at the base, at the top of that pyramid, we're going to pinpoint it. So here's a couple of rules of thumb that you can use. A good equation for direct expenses: $1,000 for every $1 million in assets. That's how you look at it. So direct expenses for a $400 million bank, $400,000 for our $200 million bank, roughly $200,000. Larger institutions have better cost scaling. So if you're above $1 billion, you've got to take this numerator down a little bit. So below $1,000 per million, they have better scaling. And the cost floor is between $100 million and $200 million institution. And for example, a $50 million institution, you can't use the rule of thumb for 50,000 anymore. You're usually about 150,000 is as low as you can drive that down on an asset basis. You can another way to calculate it is to use the table that I provided here a few slides ago. So pause the video, look at that table, and put your own numbers in there, and you can get right down to your indirect cost as well. Well, next time we're going to look at this another one of the 7 mistakes, that's failing to run compliance operations as a business. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll talk to you soon. Please join me again.